Hey everyone, I'm going to read aloud today from my book Miss E. This chapter comes pretty early in the book. I'll tell you a little bit about the story. Bets is the main character. She is a high school age girl living in California. And the section that I'm going to read happens when she comes into her history classroom one morning and discovers that the teacher has a pretty interesting project lined up for her class. One thing that you should know about the book Miss E is that it takes place in 1967. So this classroom project is going to involve some research, and you should keep in mind that back in 1967 we didn't have things like smartphones and the internet. So the task that Betts' teacher gives to his students is a lot more difficult for her than it would be for us today. There was a buzz in the hallway even before I got to history class. Kids leaving the room were all talking to each other, but clammed up when anyone else got close or tried to start a conversation, which was the opposite of the way things usually worked. Most of the time, kids leaving a classroom scattered like crows from a gunshot, eager to find a friend who was in another room, racing to find someone that had the answers to the test in science, or pretending to ignore the boy they had been sitting next to in class for the last 45 minutes. So before I even entered room 110, I knew something was different. The room was ringed with black and white photos. The anti-war poster still hung in the front of the room, but everything else had been taken down. The photos were at eye level, or what passed for eye level, for a group of teenagers who ranged in height from about 4 to 6 feet. Each photo showed a single person, with little else in the background. Okay, so Mr. Flynn had redecorated, but that didn't explain all the chatter in the hallway. He held up 2 fingers in the V-shaped peace sign that had been finding its way into everyone's hands over the last few years. Most people held it high, as if an end to the war were somewhere up above them if they could only reach it. But lately, I'd seen it flashed with an angry jab, like a shout for peace, punctuated with an or else. A couple weeks into school, Mr. Flynn had adopted it as his signal for quiet. Those still drifting in took their seats quickly, and we all gave him our attention. Mr. Flynn was the best sort of teacher. He was able somehow to trick his students into being interested in whatever topic he was covering that day. He'd also managed to gain enough of our respect that we actually listened when he asked for quiet or gave us directions. Not because he'd threatened us with a trip to the office, but because most of us genuinely liked him and wanted to please him. I imagine the school administration had felt otherwise. He was in his first year at El Molino, and the haircut and shave he'd certainly gotten for his interview had long since grown out. 100 pictures, 100 Americans. The faces of American history, our history. Mr. Flynn had a way of speaking when he wanted to add dramatic effect. His sentences shortened, some not even sentences, and with pauses between each, they started to sound like lines in free verse poetry. Your assignment is simple, he continued. Identify these faces. There was a murmur in the room as we all looked around. Some were easy. Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Albert Einstein. Others I was unsure of. Was that Franklin Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson? But most I had no idea. As I turned my head from side to side, looking at each face, I discovered something. The faces alternated, male, female, all the way around the room. 50 men, 50 women. Clearly, Mr. Flynn's list of 100 important Americans was not pulled from the pages of our history textbook. And though many of the faces staring back at me were white, some were black, Asian, Hispanic. 2 were clearly American Indian, pretty significant considering everyone sitting in the classroom looked just like me. Your task is simple, Mr. Flynn started again, and then proceeded to explain an assignment that did not sound simple at all. As a class, you need to identify these 100 Americans. You'll also need to explain in a sentence of 20 words or less why each deserves a place on these walls. 20 words or less was the kind of requirement that sounded easy but really wasn't. Your average kid would think, cool, I only have to write 100 short sentences. But how do you explain why Abraham Lincoln was important in 20 words or less? Then there were all the faces that I didn't recognize. Finding out who someone is based on their picture was like knowing someone's phone number and trying to find out their name by looking in the phone book. Were we just supposed to start flipping through encyclopedia volumes until we came across someone who looked familiar? Based on the grumblings in the room, everyone else felt the same way. Mr. Flynn held up his hand again, and we quieted. British intelligence during World War II deciphered a German code that was so complex it was considered unbreakable. They did it by putting their best people together in a room until a solution was found. You'll do the same. You'll work together as a group, same as my other classes. First class to complete all 100 Americans wins. He had said the magic word. Juniors and seniors are usually motivated to work hard in school because they're close enough to see the next step. Maybe go to college or get an actual adult job, but freshmen need a little bit more. And Mr. Flynn was smart enough to dangle a prize in front of us. I have a friend who works as a clerk in the San Francisco City Hall. He has offered to give us a tour of City Hall, and while we're in San Francisco, we'll take a tour of his city. But he can only accommodate one class. The first class to successfully complete this assignment will go on the trip. Mr. Flynn went on to rattle off a number of places that we would be visiting on the trip. But he'd already said enough. It didn't matter that we'd be visiting some boring city hall and playing tourist. In 1967, San Francisco was the place to go for music. Janis Joplin, Grace Slick, Jerry Garcia, there was no telling who else. And they weren't just playing in clubs, they were living there, walking the streets and hanging out on the corners. With a whole day spent crisscrossing the city, we were certain to run into someone. No amount of peace signs would have allowed Mr. Flynn to control the chaos that ensued. Everyone was immediately out of their seat to get a closer look at the photographs. Paper was pulled from binders and names were jotted down. A group in the corner argued about Franklin Roosevelt, or was it Wilson? In a gesture that cemented my standing in freshman society, I was pulled into a group that was strategizing the best way to divide and conquer, and my suggestion to meet in the library after school was unanimously accepted. Pushing for the door as we waited for the bell, I ended up eye to eye with one of the photos. A photo of a woman. I thought in her mid-30s, maybe around my mother's age. She smiled a big friendly smile, but it didn't show in her eyes. Years of reading my father's expressions made that easy to see. Her eyes looked tired, as if she'd been squinting into the sun all day. The woman wore a leather jacket, which seemed normal, but something about the picture made me think it was taken long ago, at a time when a woman wearing something like that would have seemed a little odd. Her hair was a mess. Not like a hairdo that had been blown in the wind and ruined. It looked intentionally careless, and something in the woman's eyes said that her appearance was as she wanted it, tousled hair and leather jacket, regardless of what anyone else thought. Her hands, planted firmly on her hips, added to her resolve. The photographer must have been positioned lower than the woman. She was looking down slightly, and because the camera was pointing up, the background revealed nothing but sky. In spite of the excitement in the room, Mr. Flynn had the last word. "This is the real world, ladies and gentlemen. You work together to accomplish a goal. Each one of you is responsible for the group's success or its failure. And the folks out in the hallway want you to fail so that they can win. Welcome to life." Leave it to Mr. Flynn to figure out what made us all tick. In a high schooler's mind, there was nothing more powerful than the fear of letting the team down. Forget adrenaline. The only thing moving that runner toward home plate or the halfback to a touchdown was the fear of what he'd face in the locker room if he messed up. The bell rang and we left the classroom. I became part of the chatter in the hallways. But all the way to my next class, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's tired, squinting eyes were still watching me. There you go. That's my read aloud. Thanks for listening.